Hey guys, we're going to do a review of the Tier 1 tomes in Age of Wonders 4 today. I've looked at some online resources for this and been really unimpressed with what's out there and wanted to give my take on these. I have quite a few hours in this game now and a lot of it in multiplayer and starting to get a sense of how the game fits together. Lots of problems with the game, but nevertheless, if you are still playing and enjoying it, let me talk through the various tomes. They are rated from worst to best in each category, and we're going to start with the very worst of the worst, which is the Tome of Zeal. So here's what the tome does. And I'm going to go over this. I'm going to try to do this relatively briefly, but still try to be hitting all of the points here. So Order is a decent starting affinity, even after the changes. Summon Zealot's pretty weak. No movement bonuses on the Zealot. It's a fighter unit. It doesn't have any real upsides to that. It's fine. It's a summon spell. It's nice for early creeping, but not particularly good. Fanatical Workforce, being a spell you have to recast, is very annoying to track. 60 production is decent. Minus food is okay. But I often just find I don't have the resources to waste on this, that the production benefits don't outweigh the costs of casting this, especially with the food detriment in there as well. It's fine, but I rarely find myself using it. Legion of Zeal is probably the best actual ability on this tome, and it's still not very good. It affects all of the weakest types of units, this being the melee units with multiple attacks, and shocked units also get this bonus, but anyway, mostly melee. Melee enchantments aren't quite as good, especially the offensive melee enchantments like this one, and I find this just to be a rather weak ability compared to the other enchantments. It's probably the best ability on this tome, but nevertheless not that great overall. Inspiring Chant is pretty useless. 2-Tile Hex is fairly large and it is a buff spell, and I do prefer buff spells to debuff spells in this game. They're just a bit more consistent. 10 Morale is fine, and 2 Strengthen is fine. Zeal is not something you always get a hold of, but obviously synergizes with the enchantment in this tome, but I still don't find it worth casting most of the time past the early game. There's just better spells out there, and your limit to 1 spell per round and limited in mana points and combat points makes it so those are pretty competitive, and I don't find this one to be all that great. It's fine. It's a big buff, big area buff, but it's only okay. And Condemnation is fairly weak. This is a single target, very small damage nuke with a debuff that is like a resistance debuff essentially to status effects. It's just not even worth casting 99.9% of the time. So really this tome really only offers a pretty weak creeping ability and points in order, which are fine. I didn't find Circle of Zealotry to be all that good, and I didn't find Condemn as a hero ability to be all that good either. Condemn as a hero ability is just a bit short range for me, so I actually don't mind it having a ability to modify an enemy's status resist, but it's never in range to do anything, so it just tends not to be very good from my perspective. So that's why it's my least rated tome. All right, moving on. Rock Tome. This one's slightly better than Zeal, but only barely. I haven't found any reason to build gargoyles. They are acceptable as a unit, but they are a hard-built unit, not a summon. And it's just not worth building hard-built units in the early game. The summons are just so much more efficient at reinforcing your army as it moves around and don't wreck your gold income, which is already pretty stressed from your buildings, the accelerated buildings from clearing all the camps, and the extra heroes that you're going to want to recruit in the early game. I don't know why I started on the far right, but I did. But let's go to Rock Blast. Rock Blast is entirely useless. It is a 30-point nuke as opposed to like the 10 or 15 that we see at this tier generally, but it is a single target nuke spell. It's almost never worth spending the resources on this. Sometimes it can be okay to finish off a wounded unit to prevent an attack, but 99% of the time I'm not casting the spell. There's just better spells out there. Not very excited about it at all. Stone Skin is also one of these. It's a single target buff spell giving some fairly okay resists, but it just isn't worth it. Single target buff spells are not good by and large. Your armies are often very large, and heal spells, invuln spells, group buff spells, and to a lesser extent group debuff spells tend to be just better than single target buff spells. I don't find the buff worth casting 99% of the time. Earthkin is okay. It's quite expensive for what it is. A single point of physical defense on your units isn't bad, but it's not great either. And Rock Camouflage and Rock Walk is an idea that's kind of interesting on one level, but it doesn't really seem to play out that well. I like having my scouts be invisible when they can, and some exploration underground with Earthkin is okay, but it's a lot for an early investment in mana for a pretty low to medium effect, really. Not very impressed with it personally. The Summon Lesser Stone Spirit is decent, but not great. I'm not super thrilled on Stone Spirits, but I really do like summons in the early game for all the reasons I've said. These spirits all have float, which is great, which means they are quite fast on all terrain, and evolving units early game are really good. If the target they're going to evolve into are even halfway decent, it's a great way to cheat out level 3 units while getting level 1 unit value in the early game. So probably the strongest of the options on this tome for Summon Lesser Stone Spirit. The Imperium type, the Materium Imperium, say that a couple times, is decent. It's not exceptional. It's probably like 3rd or 4th out of 6. It's got some okay stuff. They just buffed it a little bit, put some more early game gold generation in it, which is kind of nice. So having that as a tome choice isn't the worst. But the central quarry doesn't really do anything for me. It's a like quarry bonus. It wants adjacent quarries around it. I don't tend to build a lot of quarries in my cities. They tend to be one of the weaker improvements for me. Most of the early stuff that I'm boosting requires farms, and then I want things like mana nodes, or more likely research nodes out there, or gold. So production being a pretty low value thing for me that I'm choosing from on my buildings. So I'm not super excited about that, and I don't find obsidian weaponry, which is like a bleed effect, low chance bleed effect on my heroes, to be a very decent improvement on heroes. So overall, just a pretty weak tome in my opinion. All right, moving on. Roots. This tome just took a nerf. Vine Prison used to be extremely strong because the AI would prioritize killing vines, and you generate a ton of vines, and the AI spends a ton of actions to kill the vines, and you get way ahead in terms of action economy, but it got nerfed. So let's talk through bottom left going up. I will touch on the Vine Prison spell in a minute. Summon Entwined Thrall, real medium. I think, is this a combat summon? It doesn't say that it is. I just haven't found this unit to do very much. It's a bit slow. It is a skirmisher. I do like skirmishers, but it's not particularly exciting for me. It certainly doesn't scale into the mid to late game, so I'm not very interested in having them in my army all around. It's going to have the mana upkeep like all summons do, but it doesn't evolve into something useful. It's just there's better summons. Poison arrows and poison blades are probably the strongest parts of this tome for me. Poison arrows is fine. A lot of things are fairly blight and poison resistant, and it's a pretty low chance of poisoning at only 30%. But nevertheless, it is still just raw damage. You get 4 damage at the cost of 2 physical damage, so you're getting an overall improvement on your ranged units. The ranged units are the ones who take advantage of these small damage improvements the best, since they are often in a position to attack multiple times per round, so you get that +2 3 times a round as opposed to 1 or 2 times when you're moving your melee units into range. So I really like poison arrows as a pick from this tome. I think it's the worst of the arrow enchantments that deal damage because of the things I already said about blight and poison, but overall it's fine. Poison blades is a little bit less exciting to me. It's a less exciting poison arrows most of the time. I don't like the units that it enchants by and large, and the effects are the same as poison arrows for what it actually does. So it's like a weaker set of units affected by the same effect. It's fine if you go this tome, you're probably going to take it, but it's not exciting. Vine Prison, as I said, just got nerfed. It was a powerful combat spell. It's still fine, but it's not great anymore. And it's never been great versus players. It's only been kind of medium versus players. I'm not going out of my way for that spell anymore. Yeah, it's kind of like almost like an AI exploit, and they patched that, and now it's not great anymore. I also don't love healing roots. I don't find regeneration to be a particularly useful skill. It's maybe okay. This is temp HP. I like temp HP generation for accelerated creeping. So as you run around the map with your heroes are inevitably not at full health. Starting the combat, turn 2 I guess here, but starting the combat with some sort of heal on your hero allow you to take some damage without losing your combat efficiency. It's a pretty low costed spell at 10. It gives a fair chunk of HP. It's okay. There's a lot of these spells in the game, the healing temp HP spells, and there's a lot of ways to generate this through support units. So it's a pretty not unique effect. So you're going to find this in better ways on lots of other ways that you can impact your game. I also find nature affinity to be probably the second weakest of the affinities. So it is the weakest, or second weakest rather. So I don't want that early. I don't want to take nature generation because I don't care about the unlocks that Imperium tree is going to do for me. And then finally, poison weapons has the same issues as poison arrows and poison blades. It's the hero equivalent level up for that. I just find there's better things to take there. I'd rather not waste it on poison weapons if I can avoid it. And I haven't found a whole lot of impact off the early province improvements, especially since you can't build most of these province improvements till tier 2, I believe, right? So you have to have upgraded your central city anyways, and your central city tends to be fairly busy for a long time early. It gets almost all of the buildings, and you do build unique province improvements, but you need them to be fairly impactful, and this one just isn't that impactful. So not that excited about this tome by and large. All right, moving on. Pyromancy tome. I think this is slightly better than the Roots tome, but barely. It also runs the issue of it is a bad affinity. Chaos affinity, in my mind, is the weakest of the affinities, and it just got nerfed in the most recent patch, making it even weaker. So I certainly do not want that. I don't want my affinity generation being wasted on chaos because I don't care about any of the things that come out of the chaos tree. I think the Pyromancer is a fine unit. There's some nice synergies between the Pyromancer and the rest of the tome here, which is the Pyromancer applies an AoE burn at a fairly decent but not exceptionally great rate. And it's an okay damaging unit. I don't find the tier 2 battle mages to scale all that well. So you're maybe going to unlock this. You're going to have to hard build it. It costs you early gold. It's not going to be on the front lines. It has all the problems of hard built units. But if you do get around to hard building it or find some stash of draft or something so you get it out quickly, it's okay. And it's an enabler for some of the other things in this tome, which we'll talk about in a minute. Immolate, not very excited about any of the direct damage spells. Again, I just feel like buffs are almost certainly better than wasting your time on the direct damage spells, but it's fine. It does a little bit of fire damage, a little bit more if they're burning. There's burning synergies in this tome. Fiery arrows, I think, are a decent pickup here. Low chance burning, not particularly exciting, but again, you're attacking multiple times per round, so multiple times to apply that. The fire damage is, as a damage type, is okay, not exceptionally great, but is okay. And if we do want to enchant things, we want to enchant the range things by and large. So that's okay. Ignite. Don't find Ignite to be that good. Single target, nuke and burn and turning the ground on fire. Maybe you finish off some low hit point, high damage unit, maybe, but probably you don't care. Just almost never cast that spell. Magma Spirits are kind of annoying. They are a range attacking elemental, so they have the floating effect again. They evolve into fire elementals, which is great, but I find the a ranged unit, so in your back line, who lights all of your obstruction, all of your cover on fire every time it moves through it, is kind of annoying. I randomly will set my own units on fire by forgetting and moving my Magma Spirit first. I believe, too, that I think Magma Spirits fuck with your undo a little bit. So if you apply a status effect to the ground, like setting terrain on fire, you can't undo that move anymore, which sometimes catches me off guard when I make a slight mistake in my Magma Spirit positioning, because you're able in this game to undo any move before you make an attack, but if you change something about the battlefield like that, you can't. So I just find a small little annoyance for the Magma Spirit. And I don't actually find Fire Spirits all that great anyways, or Magma Spirits all that great anyways, so just a summon, and summons are pretty powerful. And then finally, Searing Blades, which is the melee equivalent of Fiery Arrows. Same problems as all the other melee equivalents. It's just a little bit worse. The units it affects tend to be a little bit worse. So this is fine, but not particularly great. And then there's Searing Weapons and Ritual Pyre. Ritual Pyre, neither of these are all that impactful to me. Again, Searing Weapons is a little bit better than some of the other equivalents. So occasionally I'll pick that up on heroes, but mostly not. I'm not sure where my burning synergy was. I thought maybe I'm wrong. Yeah, I might have misremembered this. It might even be slightly worse than that. I thought there was a payoff on burning synergies. It might be Searing Weapons the heroes do additional damage to burning targets, for example. There's something like that. One of the Astral Affinity ones, or Mystic Affinities, whatever it's called, the blue ones. But we'll find that in a minute. Anyways, so slightly better than Roots to me, but only barely. A couple more usable things and a nice evolving unit. All right, moving on to Warding. I like this affinity type. I think it has very strong, just got nerfed actually. They're a little bit later in the tree than they were before, but I think there's some very strong things in here. Bamsu cast on round 1 is very good. Extra world in combat points are quite good, especially if you are trying to ever use the warlord as opposed to the wizard lord or whatever it is for the hero types, where you don't have a million points just floating around. Phantasm Warrior. Okay, I guess I should start where I should start. Let's start on the bottom left. Mark of Invone is fine. You do occasionally use this in player versus player. I rarely use it outside of that. I think it's by and large worse than Steadfast as a buff, the Invone. Yes, you take no damage, but the single target restriction is quite prohibitive. I don't want to spend a lot of time single target buffing. The fights are very large in this game, often up to 18 to 18, and that's before summons. So there's tons of units on the board. So wasting my time, wasting a spell, which I get 1 of per round on a single target, is a pain. But Invone is a very powerful status effect. It's fine. I will occasionally cast this. I don't hate it when I tech it, but I don't go out of my way to tech that particular spell. The summon is decent. It has, I believe it's fairly tanky, and I believe it also floats. So I think it has the mobility bonuses, but I think it's a slow starting unit, whereas most of the floating elementals are 40 speed. I believe this guy is 32 speed, which isn't fantastic. It's the slowest units in the game. It doesn't have terrain penalties, but it also doesn't evolve into anything. So I find this to be a fairly low tier summon. It's going to help you clear stuff early, but you don't want a bunch of them. It's not going to stick around. It's not going to be good in the mid and late game, and it's not going to help you in most of your fights here. It's just for creeping essentially, but it is nevertheless a summon for creeping. I like magical wards, but it's expensive, and I might just like it because I like the very tanky hero stuff if you can do that. And lightning resist is quite valuable, and frost resist is quite valuable. So of those, it has some very nice resists, but it's not a lot. These are like 10, I think this is about 19% damage reduction off of each of those types, assuming you had none to begin with, which is okay, but it's not exceptionally great. And race transformations run into the issue that any of your summons and anytime you take over a vassal of a different race or get like recruitments from wonders or this type of thing, they don't apply to that. So or if you take a hero from a different race, for example, they won't get this. So you have to be kind of conscientious about what your army composition is made up of to get maximum value out of magical wards, and the effect of that is not major anyways, but I still like it. I like magical wards. I like the enhancements and transformations by and large of these. Static Shield I think is garbage. It's another single target spell. It's very expensive, 30 mana and 20 combat points, and it applies. Units attacking that have a chance to stun themselves. Stun's a powerful effect, no problem with that, but players are going to avoid attacking into that, and you don't need this to beat the AI, and it's a lot of mana to waste for creeping. Creeping is a resource game. Your goal is to creep as efficiently as possible. You want as few units as possible to generate as much experience per. You want to take as little damage per round so you can keep going as much as you can, and you want to spend as little mana as possible so that you can continue to accrue resources for the bigger objectives. So you're trying to do everything as cheaply as possible when you're creeping, and Static Field is the opposite of that. It's a very expensive spell for not a lot of impact there. Stun's powerful, but 60% isn't incredible before any sort of resist, and it just tends not to be worth it for me. I like Staves of Warding, but not exceptionally. It's another low impact buff spell, right? So is it good that my support units just passively apply 2 bolstered resistance, which is damage reduction from magical effects? Yeah, that's nice. I don't hate that. That's just a rider effect that happens on things I'm already doing with my support units. Support units are pretty strong. It's nice to have that, but it's also not exceptionally great. It's not going to help you for any physical attacks, obviously, and its impact is going to be somewhat minor. But I think that's a totally decent enhancement to pick up, and there's a lot of strategies that synergize with mass enhancements, so no problems there for that. Bolstering support I found to be pretty weak as a hero ability, and there's no unique province for this unlock, so neither of those are particularly strong. But I think between magical wards, the option of Invone, a decent summon, although not a good summon, and a decent enhancement, I think this is a top C tier tome. All right, moving on. Let's go to enchantment. This is a fun little tree. We've already talked a little bit about the Materium Imperium. I think that's a decent starting Imperium. Looking at this, Awakened Tools is pretty solid. The stability hit is very noticeable, but a sustain spell means once you cast it, you just pay a mana upkeep on it. You don't have to cast it again, and it's a permanent thing on the city till you cancel it. I don't really care that much about the 20 production, although it's all right. I talked already about production earlier in this video. I think it's a fine stat, but not exceptionally great. You want a bunch of that early if you can do it, because you want to get your buildings coming out, but you do run out of exceptionally great buildings to build, and buildings are expensive, so sometimes accelerating that's its own problem. But I really like the draft portion of this. oftentimes I have a single city, almost always my capital, that is producing a tier 2 or tier 3 unit that I have teched for. For example, any of the tier 3 archers that come out on the tier 2 tomes, or perhaps I'm going for my tier 3 unit, so I've paid the very expensive upgrade to getting my capital city to a tier 3 city. I like having draft on demand that I can cancel when I'm done producing units, but I can help burst recruit the things I want to do. So quite like Awakened Tools. I don't know why I started top left. I keep doing this. I guess I'll now go to Spell Tempered Shields just to throw you all off. My apologies. Spell Tempered Shields I think is fairly weak. I don't really think one resistance is that great, and I think Shield Unit is literally the weakest unit type in the game. So this is an enhancement that only affects your shield units and does a thing that isn't that powerful. I think Seeker Arrows are fine. A lot of the ranged attackers are physical, but this means that basically battle mages are not going to get this. This is just your archers and your skirmisher units. +1 range is great. You kind of have to lean into that a little bit because range comes with accuracy penalties, but you can do lots of things to mitigate those accuracy penalties. And I think this upgrade is fine. Range is very powerful in this game, and range focus fire is very powerful in this game. So picking up Seeker Arrows for any sort of archer strategy is totally reasonable. Already talked about Awakened Tools. Let's go to Sundering Blades. I think Sundering Blades is also okay. It has a wider range of targets than just shield. It's going to hit all your melee units. Sunder is probably a little bit better than reducing physical armor is probably a little bit better on average than reducing magic armor. By and large, there's just more physical damage in your armies. So having that reduction is okay. And it's another enchantment. So once you get it out, it's not that bad. And it's not super expensive to cast or upkeep. I don't love it, but I don't hate it. It's kind of a medium spell for me. Copper Golem is an interesting one. It is a early game weak polearm unit, but it evolves. It's slow because it is a ground-based golem unit, so it doesn't have any of the floating effects. So it's a pretty slow 32 move unit, but it evolves into iron golems, which are pretty solid blocker units. I think probably one of the best blocker units in the game, in the early game anyways. So you get a decent evolving unit. It's the wrong unit type. It's a shield unit by and large. Well, the evolved version is a shield unit. The Copper Golem's a polearm unit. So I don't find that type of unit to be super strong, but you can do things like put a wall between your archers and your enemy units, which is what you're trying to do, and buff all your archers' defensive stats. And your archers' defensive stats, especially the tier 1 archers, are very weak. They're like 0/0. So getting the shield wall impact on those and also the resistance or immunity to status effects that the iron golems convey to the archers is also okay. So I like Copper Golems because I like their evolved unit that comes out of them. I don't find Sundering Strikes on heroes to be worth it, and I don't find their Rune Carver's camp to be particularly powerful. So again, it's okay, but not exceptionally great here. Let's move on to the Faith Tome. All right, Tome of Faith. Getting a little bit better at this point. We're now at I think this is the midway point, right? This is the 6th of 12. 7th of 12. So we're just past the midway point for the tomes here. Again, I like order early. I think the impact of infestation and infestation and free city clearing to boost your relationships with other free cities, I think is quite powerful. I think a second Whispering Stone is quite powerful. I like the early game impact of order. So having an early order tome is very nice for your affinities. I think the Abbey is probably one of the better tier 1 province improvements too, which is kind of nice. It's a knowledge improvement, counts as a knowledge outpost that you can build anywhere, and surrounding farms boost the knowledge that comes out of that, I believe, and that tends to be okay. I also don't hate Mending Touch on heroes. It does end the turn, but it is nice for creeping in the early game, and also on that turn 1 when your units have just been deployed to throw out some buffs, some HP buffs, so to basically replace missing HP on units before the fight starts. That's okay. All right, let's start with the Chaplain. I think the Chaplain is probably my favorite of the tier 2 units that you get off of tomes. It is quite a powerful support unit. It has a nice single target damage buff for starting the round. I don't love single target buffs, but this isn't a casted buff. I'm not using this at the cost of one of my spells. I'm using this on a unit, and it's got a decent single target heal. I think it's just a decent unit. It complements the strategy of low numbers of units with high numbers of heroes for early creeping. That way you maximize your experience from everything you're doing. It fits in really nicely for that. It's got really good sustain. It keeps your army going without having to come back to neutral territory, without having to waste time spending turns where you're not fighting to heal. It's just a good unit for that. I mean, it has the downsides of having to train it, and it has a draft cost, and it has gold cost up front, but it's a powerful unit, and it scales reasonably well into the late game by and large. So I like that. Convent's an interesting one. I had a game where this paid off. This is a building. It gives you knowledge and mana based on your stability. I think there's 4 tiers of stability, I think, in the end, of above like positive stability. And the problem is stability is hard to come by. The buildings for it are expensive. It's up against every time you expand your borders, every time you place another province down, you lose stability. It's hard to get value out of this, and it was very expensive. 250 hammers was quite a lot early, like that production cost. So I found it on the weak side. I do occasionally get a game where it plays out pretty well, but by and large, I'm not building convents very often. Army Heal is an interesting one. This is a world map spell, so you can do this. You can combine units to get max effectiveness of this. So you just take your wounded units, put it into one stack, and heal that. I don't hate it. I don't love it either. I like that it doesn't use my combat stuff. I don't want to spend a lot of mana on this, but it is some ways I can rush camps that I couldn't rush otherwise. Oftentimes, you fight some big wonder fight, you get good resources out of that, but your army's a little bit weak. This maybe allows you to not have to go home for a couple turns. I found it fine, not great, but fine. Faithful Whispers is another one of these ones. It's tough to evaluate this one. This is a buff spell that you cast on a city state to take a percentage increase of the allegiance that you generate per turn. So basically improving relations with this city faster. Its impact seems to be something like in the 2 to, like if you're focusing on city states, it's like the 2 to 3 range for its impact. And the mana upkeep isn't super high. I don't know what this actually works out to be. In my head, I think this is okay. I'm not sure if I actually went and tracked the games that I've used it, how many turns it saves me. I do go for it, especially if I'm going for some of the city state or free city strategies where I am attempting to very early get trades going with free cities to set up my economy. I do use this spell, and I like the spell. It's fine. But I may be overvaluing it. It's really tough to tell. Staves of Mending is excellent. This is a free action range 1 heal applied to all of your support units. So they can just, and with like a couple turn cooldown, and a upkeep reduction for your support units. Both of those are nice passive effects that are just beneficial. The turn 1 free action buff or heal rather is really nice. It basically means your wounded units start the fight at full health instead of at like 3/4 health or something like that. It's not a huge heal, but it's just nice. It's just a nice value thing. It synergizes nicely with the chaplain that you're already building. It's just a pretty good one. And then Wrath of the Faithful is probably my least favorite upgrade on this tome. I almost never use this. If you have a ton of faithful units, maybe it's a decent single target removal spell. It's cheap on mana and combat points. So if you do have the reason to cast it, it's not particularly prohibitive resource wise, but not doing a whole lot for me by and large. I think it's probably the weakest one on the card or on the tome. All right, let's move on to Souls. Tome of Souls, I think just got a little bit of a nerf to me. They fixed the bug with Soul Overflow. So I've just moved this slightly down. This was A tier for me and is now B tier, but it's probably the top of the B tier. Let's talk about this. Shadow Affinity is a pretty powerful affinity. Lots of good stuff in the early part of Shadow Affinity, and I think the medium bit of Shadow Affinity falls off a bit, but then I think the late Shadow Affinity is okay again. So that's what that is. That's okay. Having access to souls early is great. Souls are a resource that you will collect passively for killing things. So doing the things you're already doing, you get the same rewards. You don't lose any rewards for getting that, but now you get souls as well. Souls can be used for a number of different things across the course of the game. There's other tomes that utilize souls as well. So getting this online early is quite nice. The actual cards in here are not particularly exceptional. Soulfire is fine. The fact it doesn't use mana is nice, so you can use this like if you're doing some sort of summon strategy, which you often are, and maybe you're doing evolving summons, which are very mana intensive. It is nice to have a damage spell that doesn't require a mana cost, but mostly you don't want to be blowing your souls on just random nukes, and random nukes aren't particularly powerful anyways. So I'm not super thrilled about Soulfire, but it is there as a flexibility option to synergize with the other strategies. Bone Golems and the zombie, which is another part of the soul thing. I'm not sure exactly. I think you. I remember exactly how you get your first zombies off this, but neither bone golems nor zombies are particularly good, and having to build this unit. You can get bone golems by combining two skeletons. I guess they're not zombies. By combining two skeletons or training them out of your cities. I didn't find bone golems worth very much to me. I didn't really want this unit in my army. I didn't find it super strong. But again, it's another synergy thing, right? Using souls instead of money is worth something, and getting them by combining skeletons is worth something too. So this is essentially a fodder unit, and I mean, it makes sense, right? These are the hordes of undead units that are supposed to be fodder for what you're doing. Great. It's fine. Soulbinders. This was right. Okay. So this is the enhancement for battle mages and support units that gives them extra damage and versus soulbound units, and gives them a chance to apply soulbound. I don't think this matters that much. It's fine. It's another way to increase your soul income, and it's an enhancement. It only affects a couple units, so it's going to be fairly cheap in upkeep. These are the types of units you tend to have around often in the early game, which are support units in particular. So I don't hate it. It's just a way to accelerate your soul income. It's not majorly impactful. The damage off support units is not super relevant. Later on, the damage from battle mage units can be, especially if you're building one of the battle mage builds, which are fairly popular, like triple warlock or early starting build kind of deal. Then this gets a little bit better. I don't hate it. Don't love it. It's totally reasonable. Soulbind Army, I don't think is very good. I don't want to spend 45 mana every time I clear a camp to get a small number of souls. Yeah. I guess you can, like all the world spells, the world enemy army spells, you can prepare this once, and when you actually go into battle for your first time fighting your opponent, generally a player, but I guess AI too, you can stack a bunch of negative spells right on the first turn that you attack, and this could be one of those, and that's fine. 10% damage to all your units that have the ability to pay off for soulbound units is fine, but it's not going on my way. Soul Overflow, awesome. They just nerfed it. It used to stack indefinitely with itself, but it's just a powerful effect. 20 HP that cannot be dispelled, and removing all the negative effects in an AoE 1, so you know the central hex and all the hexes around it, plus strengthen is just a really nice spell. Doesn't cost mana either, so if you're doing any of the summon strategies, you can utilize souls here. I like this tome mostly for the Shadow Affinity and the early Soul Collection, and it has a number of nice situational utility buffs, either units that don't cost me gold, nukes that don't cost me mana, or buffs that don't cost me mana, and rider effects on units that I'm already using. So I think none of these things are standout powerful, but I think all of these things combined make this tome quite powerful. All right, moving on. Horde Tome. I initially overvalued this tome a little bit. I think I moved it down to A from S. There's some really cool things on this tome, but there's also some downsides. This is Chaos Affinity. This is the weakest of the early game affinities, in my opinion. Mob Camp is only a tier 1. It gives you food and draft and recruitment for tier 1. Makes that cheaper recruitment cost for tier 1, which I don't think is a very good effect at all. Battle Seeker training is damage for tier 1, I believe, units in your army, which is fine. There's stuff you do as like Barbarian start with like Skirmishers and the Stun Warriors that is fine, but none of this scales into the mid and late game at all, really. Let's break down these spells. Helmmaster both got a buff and a nerf recently. They're now a mounted unit for some reason, but the summon part of that got nerfed. I think Helmmasters are a pretty powerful unit. They don't scale super well, but fodder is good, and they are a crossbow style unit, so they can move then shoot once kind of deal. I think they're fine. They were a little bit better before, I think, but they are still a okay unit. You're not going to build a lot of them. They're not a summon, and they're only a tier 2, so they don't scale super well into the late game, but they're fine for efficient creeping with the summon. That's not bad. Spawnkin is the big selling point of Tome of the Horde to me. This is a racial transform, so it affects all units that you have either unlocked through tomes, heroes of your race, or units that you can build already from your faction. And it gives them more unit models if they have unit models. If they only have a single unit model, it does not change the number of unit models, and that's super important. So your heroes just get a flat 20% damage. Why? I don't know, but no downside to that. Your units that get this, that have multiple models, do get a slight downside, which is their damage falls off at a slightly different rate than it did before because there's more models, and when you lose models, you lose damage, but it still always ends up a net positive for damage. It's just not a straight 20% damage all the time. It's only a straight 20% damage for multi-model units when they're unwounded. But it's a really powerful transform. So this is the big selling point of Tome of the Horde for me. It's a very, very, very powerful ability. Blaze of the Horde synergizes with the swarmy tier 1 strategies, but not that well in my opinion. It's a good nuke if you like nukes, but I don't like nukes in this game very much, so it's fine. And again, I don't think tier 1 armies scale super well into the mid and late game, although sometimes you can catch an enemy with just your super accelerated horde early, in which case this could be a very useful ability. Summon Irregulars is a pretty weak spell in isolation. Summoning a non-scout tier 1 unit is pretty bad. However, the Barbarian tier 1 units are very good compared to other tier 1 units. The Skirmisher that has no cooldown on their ranged ability and the Stunning Warrior are both excellent units in the early game. So Summon Irregulars gets a little bit of a boost if you're playing one of the Barbarian strategies. And the Barbarian, with their Ritual of Alacrity, are very mobile and very aggressive early. So Summon Irregulars plays nicely into that strategy if you're going to go do that. I just don't think it scales at all. And as summons go, it's pretty crap summons. However, no mana cost either, because it summons actual physical units that come out as costing you gold. So pros and cons there. And then finally, Fury of the Horde. It's a surprisingly decent spell. Again, with that one strategy, right? It is a buff spell, and if you have 2 or 3 stacks of units, which you can do very rapidly as the swarmy kind of horde strategy, buffing all of them for 10% damage starts to get decent for payoff, especially for only 10 mana and 10 combat points. I think this spell almost always gets outscaled rapidly. Like most of the times I have better spells that I want to cast by the time I have my second or third tome open, but in the very early game, or the very early wide fights, this can be quite powerful. But remember, hero experience is in part based on the relationship to the numbers of enemies that you fight. So you don't want lots of swarmy units when you're creeping. You just want lots of swarmy units when you're actually fighting hard targets like other players. So ups and downs on this, but still, Spawnkin is so good that this just gets boosted in, and then there's a lot of other supplementary stuff in here that's totally reasonable. All right, moving on. Cryomancy rather. This tome was a bit of a sleeper hit for me. As I've played more and more, this one has gone up and up in my considerations. I like Shadow Affinity, probably my top 2, maybe top 3, depending on exactly the strategy I'm running, but up there. It scales well too, so Shadow stuff is good. Frost Weapons as an upgrade is quite nice. In addition to Frost Damage, I believe Frost Weapons is the hero one that gives me damage versus frozen or slowed targets, or possibly just frozen targets. But either way, it's a pretty regular increase in damage to my heroes at a low tier of battle unlock for them, which is reasonable. And School of Cryomancy is fine. It is another, I believe it's a knowledge improvement, which is pretty good. It's nice to replace farms and quarries or foresters in provinces that don't have a lot of options with the higher value knowledge or gold producing provinces when you can. So I like this province as provinces go. It's not an exceptionally good one. It's worse than, for example, the Abbey, but it's nice to be able to take a tile that can normally only get a farm and cheat the restrictions by building a unique province there. All right, let's talk about the spells. Ice Coffin is excellent. Surprisingly, it just turns out that a stun on demand is really good, and a cheap stun on demand for early creeping is also really good. This is often the difference between a unit getting an attack or not getting an attack, and this allows you to take out like early like Dragon Camp or something like this, because you can just stun the dragon repeatedly. And frost damage tends to be decent in this game. There are a lot of fire units that are quite vulnerable to it. It's just a decent damage type by and large. So I like Ice Coffin. I'm not casting it a lot, but I am casting this. I basically never cast this in like player versus player, though you can disable heroes with it, which is okay as well. 90% base chance is a good chance for stunning, but it's a surprisingly decent creeping spell, which was surprising to me because mostly I don't find damage spells to be very good. It's just that disable is so good. Frostblades it's another rider effect, but it's probably my favorite of the rider effects, right? Which is extra damage against frozen or slowed units and frost damage, which is great. It does apply only to melee units, which I think is the weaker of the enchantment types, enchantment types. But I think this is, as they go, this is probably the best of those. Well, second best. I think the lightning one's better. But anyways, this is a decent one. Blizzard is fine on the world map. -2 status resist to an army before you attack is okay. This is probably the weakest of the abilities on this tome. But again, with world army spells, you can often preemptively you can take a turn where you're not using your global points and just cast the spell and keep it banked until you do encounter the enemy, and then you can dump all of them on them on that same starting turn for a pretty big impact a pretty big alpha strike kind of impact. And this is just another spell that does okay with that. Minus status resist is a decent effect as well. It allows all your other effects to be more likely to land. So the enemy heroes are going to have something like 4 or 5 status resist almost all of the time. And then removing 2 or 3 of that before you start the fight means maybe you can land some stuns on enemy heroes, which is great. Summon Lesser Snow Spirit. Snow Spirits are probably my second favorite of the elementals. After the Storm Spirit, which we'll talk about later. It's a skirmisher unit that has a frozen stun as its ranged attack. It does have a cooldown on that ranged attack, but it's really good for creeping. Again, you can often disable high damage enemy units with the frozen effect. And frozen is going to be an enabler for all of your rider effects, right? All your hero damage, your unit damage off of the enchantments. So it's just a really nice one. And it evolves into the not lesser Snow Spirit, just the Snow Spirit, which is a totally reasonable skirmisher unit, right? So I like skirmisher units by and large, and skirmisher units with stuns, which is essentially what they are, is quite a neat one. It has all the upsides of elementals too. It floats, so it doesn't care about terrain, and it's 40 speed as opposed to 32 speed. So it's a decent unit by and large, and it's a summon, so you can apply it to the front lines. You can summon it on your armies. You can summon it near nodes to get the extra little bit of reach for that turn. It's just decent. I also like the White Witch. Surprisingly, it's another tier 2 battle mage, which isn't exceptionally great, but it has single target frozen debuff again at a decent chance. I think it's a 90% chance to start with, which means a couple of these early can be really good at enemy hero or single target creeping strategies, right? So disable enemy heroes or disable like the big dragon kind of stuff is all pretty decent. And then finally, Frost Arrows is my second favorite of the ranged enhancements. Frost is a decent type. Extra damage versus frozen or slowed units synergizes nicely with all the other things you're doing on this tome. And archers attack multiple times per round, which means the two net damage they get, plus 4 frost, minus 2 physical, is applied 3 times per round as opposed to 1 or 2 for the melee stuff by and large. So I think just good stuff. All this stuff synergizes nicely with itself. It synergizes nicely with the other things you're doing. This tome is pretty solid. All right. And then finally, let's move on to the S tier tomes. Honestly, Cryomancy is right on the border of S and A for me. I put it in A, but you could probably round this up to a low S. Anyways, let's take a look at the Beast Tome. So, biggest problem with Beast Tome is the nature affinity is not very good. Wildlife Sanctuary is also not great. Spiders are a really good beast type. There's a couple of decent beast types, but being able to recruit low-level beasts is not something you care about, especially with the Summon Wild Animal spell, which we'll talk about in a minute. It just isn't very relevant. Pack Leader is a fine hero support skill. I don't really like hero support skills by and large, and I don't like the army skills in particular because I find that my heroes do not stay nicely with the army. They're almost always faster. They're almost always doing their own thing compared to the army. But as army leader skills go, this one is decent. It's quite easy to get lots of units that are affected by Pack Leader. All right. Marcus Prey. Marcus Prey is pretty OP. Super low mana cost, super low combat cost, 5. And it takes a unit and makes all attacks against that unit be flanking attacks. And then it also takes that unit and sunders its defense times 3. So it removes 3 physical damage reduction, which is something like 27% damage reduction or something like that, right? I guess it'd be 19. Yeah, I think it's 28 or 27% damage reduction for physical. So this is nasty. Flanking attacks are nasty. It's additional damage. There's other traits like Flanker that can key off of that, and it's demoralizing to the target being hit. So this is a very powerful focus firing spell. It's also dirt cheap, so you can absolutely use this creeping. It does fall off in terms of you'd rather cast bigger, better spells later, but in the early game, it's super nasty. Summon Wild Animal is excellent, or rather, it can be excellent. It just got a nerf in terms of how often you get tier 2 animals, but unlike the other tier 1 summon spells, you can get tier 2 summons out of this, and some of those tier 2 summons can evolve into tier 3 units. Spiders in particular are nice because they all evolve, so if you hit spider summons out of this, you often get a really nice unit that keeps scaling across the course of the game, and you can deliberately kill off these summons that you get if you don't hit the ones you want, you can just tank aggressively with them to help clear stuff. Summon spells again, and again are super powerful for early creeping, and this is no exception. It's quite a good spell. It's just a very nice spell. Just got a nerf basically because it was too good. Call of the Wild is also fairly reasonable. This is a wide effect. I'm not casting this quite as much, especially in the creeping fights. But again, if you do go a swarmy early game strategy, which Nature and Chaos Affinities are a little bit better at, this one is going to hit a lot of targets, and it has 3 effects, 2 bolstered defense and 1 strengthen. That's okay. I'm not going out of my way for Call of the Wild, but as a wide spell, it's decent. Wild Speakers just received a nerf and a buff. Someone's got nerfed, which they do summon, but they also are now a mounted unit. I don't love Wild Speakers. I find them a little bit worse than Houndmasters by and large. Supposedly the single target beast buff they have might scale into the late game if you're using mid and late game beasts, but I don't love Wild Speakers. They're only okay. They're a non-summon unit. You're going to have to recruit them. They're going to cost you golden draft to do that, but they are impacted by like your racial transforms, which is kind of nice, but I'm not using a lot of Wild Speakers. Maybe to clear an early wonder to get just that extra summon unit into the fight kind of deal, but eh. And then Animal Kinship is a racial transform, very solid racial transform. If you have an army that is composed almost entirely of animal or cav units, your heroes tend to be cav units. They tend to find horse units for them and want that, and animal units are a dime a dozen. And if you are going out of your way to synergize with that, this is basically 10% damage, 10% critical hit chance for your entire army. It is a racial transform, so it doesn't impact summons or recruitment from, for example, wonders. But if you are building racial units and can keep the cav and beast count high, this is a very powerful buff. And some of the strategies involving racial mounts, which just got a buff, are also related to Animal Kinship. So I think this stays strong as a racial transform. So I like the beast tome. I think Marcus Prey and Summon Wild Animal are what's carrying this, but I think Animal Kinship is also very good, and Pack Leader can be quite good as well. So a lot of strong things with this. The weakest part, basically just that is Nature Affinity. All right, moving on. The final tome here, talking about Tome of Evocation. This is my favorite tome at Tier 1. So why? Well, I don't care about Channeling Tower, and Lightning Weapons are decent, but not exceptional. They are the hero equivalent of Lightning Blades of Lightning Blades. There isn't a Lightning one at Tier 1 for this. Interesting. Hold on. We'll get to that in a second. I'm getting ahead of myself here. I also think the blue affinity, I can never remember if it's Astral or Mystic. I think it's an Astral affinity, and the Mystic faction is the blue faction. Anyways, it's a really nice affinity by and large. Lots of powerful early and mid effects, even though it just got nerfed. So getting points in this early is great. Lightning Blades are fine. I don't really care about the electrified effect on my melee units. Particularly, it's a low chance to apply. The dot effects are affected by resistances. So even if you hit your 30% chance minus the chance that they resist this already, and then you get your dot applied, it's never going to do 8 damage to, which is the base value of it. It's never going to do that full amount to any unit you care about past like a very small amount of time, and they only take that at the end of their turn. So I don't really care about the dot effect. It's not very good. But enhancements that give extra damage to your units that multi-attack is fine. These are only the melee ones, so it's pretty unexciting, but it's fine. I'm not going on my way for that, but I don't dislike it when I have it. Lightning Focus is an interesting one. It's basically Lightning Blades, but applied to support units and battle mage units as opposed to the archer units. I use a lot of support units, but I don't think they're really a damage dealing unit. But if you go the battle mage strategy, this is very solid. You just get 2 extra damage per attack if you're multi-attacking, which the battle mages often do. This is applied multiple times. The electrify effect is a nice rider. It's not a nice rider. We just talked about why it's not a nice rider, but it's a palatable rider. It's more damage if you land it. But mostly I like it because it affects the range units, and I like lightning damage by and large. I think it's one of the best damage types. All right, moving on. Lightning Torrent. This one is reasonable too. If you're running lightning enhancements and lightning units, and we'll get to the Storm Spirit in a minute, Lightning Torrent is a damage buff for your entire army. It is a world map spell. So you're not going to be casting it a lot. And again, you can pre-prep world map spells to hit armies and then alpha strike with them. So it's totally reasonable. The 20 damage is bugged in some way. It doesn't really seem to do 20 damage to every unit in the army. So it may even get better as these things get unnerfed. And I will preemptively prep this spell if I take this spell. But I probably never cast this versus anything except other player armies, basically. Moving on, the Evoker. I'm okay with Evoker. Again, it's a tier 2 unit that doesn't scale super well into late game. You have to hard build it. It's slow to get to the front lines. All the problems with other draft units, but it is a decent unit applying multiple lightning attacks to targets, as well as having, having the option to multi-attack, and then having its, all the battle mages have a secondary ability that has a cooldown that can be cast at a fairly decent range that does damage in some way. And this one it hits, I think, multiple targets, kind of that. It's like a lightning that jumps around kind of deal. It's fine. I'm not building a lot of these, but I'm not super sad about it either if I have an Evoker or two on the field. I think Summon Lesser Storm Spirit is the best summon spell in the game at tier 1, and also one of the just best overall units out there at tier 3. So what you get access to is the Lesser Storm Spirit, which is not particularly exciting. It's an elemental, so it floats. So 40 movement speed and floating means it's pretty quick on the world map, so pretty good about terrain. But it has inherent, it does lightning damage too, which is a nice damage type. It synergizes with your lightning torrent spell, for example, on your team. It's a skirmisher, which is sick, and this one's not a skirmisher. This one is a shock unit, but it has at tier 1, it's pretty useless. Like all the tier 1 elementals are fairly weak, but as you feed experience into the elementals, which you can do from an early point if you're creeping with them, it will level up. It will evolve rather to tier 3, and the tier 3 Storm Spirit is amazing. All the Storm Spirits have they're resistant to arrow fire, basically, right? So any ranged attack has a lower chance to hit them by quite a bit, and the Storm Spirit at level 3 has a mobility effect. So it's a shock unit, so it only attacks once, but it attacks once quite hard. And it has a teleport effect at tier 3 with a pretty short cooldown that applies AoE, the electrify effect basically, and AoE around it. So you have extreme mobility in the ability to flank your opponent and get on the targets they don't want you to have with these Storm Spirits. And your Storm Spirits are very resistant to focus fire from ranged attacks. I think they are probably the best early game unit for this type of fight, right? The best ability to disrupt your enemy's plans while being relatively safe until you deploy them, and being fairly resistant to being focused down once you do deploy them. It's a crazy powerful unit, and having access to a summon that evolves into that from the early game is a very powerful effect. Synergizes with the lightning blades. Not great because it's only a single attack, but it is another unit that's applied to, and synergizes with the lightning damage off of lightning torrent as a whole. Just some really, really powerful units. What's carrying this tome for me. And then finally, Fulmination. I'm not excited about Fulmination. I've already talked about why I don't think Electrify is a particularly good effect. 15 damage is not a particularly high amount of damage. AoE 1 is not a particularly large radius. And I think there's better spells to be casting by and large than damaging spells most of the time in combat. So probably my least favorite of the cards in here, but it doesn't matter because the summon Lesser Storm Spirit is such a powerful ability that if I only had access to that on this tome, it's still up there with the other tomes, and all these other small effects are just nice little additions to it. All right. This was quite a video in terms of length, but I wanted to give a little bit more depth than just, oh, what are your favorite tomes and how do you rank them? I wanted to give some justifications for why I'm ranking them as I am, and I wanted to give a little bit of, through this video, a little bit of a framework of the types of things I'm evaluating when I evaluate these tomes. If you enjoyed the tier 1 tome review and I get good response to that, I'm happy to do more of these. There's tier 2s, tier 3s, tier 4s, and tier 5 tomes. I have a fair amount of experience with tier 2 and 3, tier 2 and tier 3 tomes. That's hard to say. And would be happy to do more of these if we like them. Anyways, guys, thanks for watching. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I'm sure everyone will have a slightly different rating of these, but I think I did an okay job of justifying why I think as I do about these tomes. Thanks for watching, guys. See you soon.